How could I have anticipated that moment? Alter my life entirely. It was only a typical day till I entered that room, and I saw that the door was open. Something inside of me a little changed in a matter of seconds. I could have disregarded it and turned back, but I didn't, due to the fact that when I realized I had no idea what I was looking at, never again would things be the same. And sure, I was at fault in this case, because I was the initiator and the one who continued. George was working, and the home was calm, but I could hear a few faint sounds approaching. Elliot was in his room upstairs. At first, I didn't give it much thought. An additional instance of a youth engrossed in his own world, but perhaps he might like a coffee. A brief discussion could be pleasant. I made an effort as I ascended the steps to determine the source of the noises. From as I approached his room, I observed that the door was ajar a little. Paused before calling out to him. But then Elliot caught my attention. He was his laptop resting on his lap, while he sits on his bed, the glowing screen illuminating his face. He had his hands moving, and first I assumed he was merely observing something. Thrilling, possibly an action film, but as I changed my perspective and took one more step, felt my face's blood drain. That was the point at which I understood exactly what Elliot was working, when I noticed the screen's reflection and a chilling wave came over me. I wasn't prepared for this, wasn't interested in seeing this. Elliot frantically attempted to gather his thoughts, hastily turning down the volume on his laptop, but it was already too late. Had already occurred when we looked at each other. His face flushed hot from the embarrassment in his gaze. I'm sorry, he said without denying, stuttered, averting my gaze, feeling trapped in location. The door, I began, but I was at a loss for words. I had no idea what I was even attempting to say. I felt a peculiar feeling come over me. Yes, I was humiliated, but I was also rushing ideas that I was unable to fully grip. I hurriedly left the room. My chest is thumping with my heart. I put my hands to my face in an attempt to control my breathing and ask, "What the hell was that?" I said in a whisper. What had I completed? Why had I been so irresponsible? But was I the only one at fault here? "Stop it, Darlene," I sharply told myself, but it set off the turmoil inside of me. By more than simply my observations of Elliot was 23 years old and no longer a child, but I was 47 as well. A woman who had gone through I have my share of embarrassment in life. Never encountered a circumstance such as this previously, but I understood what shame felt, as though I was motionless in the corridor. I ran my fingers while my heart continued to race, trying to drag myself through my hair. Jointly, when Elliot showed up he repositioned the collar of his shirt, kept his neck clear, and eyes turned away. "I apologize, Darlene. I believed I had," he said, his voice uncertain, and closed the door. However, I shook my head immediately and honestly, turning away. No, no, I should have apologized instead of you," I said, knocking before entering. Hastily, unsure of what else to do. Silence, to be sure, but this wasn't any quiet. We had shared a home together, years, but this was the first occasion when we had ever exchanged glances like this. For the first time, this type of "we are at odds," so I should go. Go downstairs and begin making something. "For supper," I answered, turning swiftly. In the direction of the stairs, my voice was shaking, but I was attempting to contain it. "Together." Elliot remained silent, simply followed me with his gaze as though he was attempting to put something together. In his thoughts before to the major event occurring between me and Elliot. Don't please remember to subscribe to my channel. Turn on alerts and pay attention to this narrative through to the very end. I swear. It's going to get really thrilling up until that night when we didn't talk to each other. Don't text or look at each other. Contact, not even casual conversation, but that it hinted in the hush that things would never be the same again. We sat down to dinner, at the same table, but we were unable to see at one another. The sole noise being the sound of cutlery clinking against our plates. In order to alleviate the both of us were aware of the tension. But how? After the night the following day, and the after that, everything appeared to be normal. However, our quiet was essentially all that existed, created the unseen conflict between us, get even more powerful. And then one Elliot took a seat beside me in the afternoon. Could see that he was hesitating, but he was obviously trying to solve Darlene's remarks from the other day. I'm extremely ashamed. I apologize for not. Please, I would like things to be this way. Don't let this destroy the relationship between. He spoke to us in a trembling but earnest tone. I inhaled deeply, regardless of how this was what I needed. Odd and surprising. To calm him, I shrugged and smiled. A little and uttered, "Oh, Elliot, trust me. I've experienced plenty of embarrassing times throughout the years." Next, I shared a handful of the times when he smiled, loosened up a bit, and nodded his. The shame subsided a little at that. At one point, it appeared as though the tension between us had decreased, yet in my heart, I recognized that nothing had really happened, even if it appeared that everything was getting. This talk would have been much better if removed the barriers that separated us and me. Could sense that things were going to change. Much moreover, Elliot gave a little laugh. He looked down at the table and said, "I suppose we're even now," he said, scowled a little and faced him, asking, "What do you mean?" I inquired, my interest beginning to grow. Into my voice for a little moment. His face changed as if he had just discovered that he had said something that he stroked the back of his head, unable to retract. For a second, his neck hesitated, but he had already begun, and he now lacked having no other option. He took a deep. He grumbled, took a breath, and then turned away. "I've seen that you just was unaware of it." It seemed as though a surge of electricity swept through my body. Paused for a second. "What?" I muttered as his words' weight weighed heavily on Elliot's face was red on me, but he said, "I didn't tell you because I was too ashamed. Yet I will always remember regarding it. In fact, it was my small secret that I was unable to escape my head. My heart was racing uncontrollably. I felt a weird warmth, that strange feeling that gave me a clue, had altered Elliot's statements, weren't only a confession. They crushed every last dividing line between us. I glanced at him, was observing me as well, and by this point, we both realized that this wasn't your typical dialogue. The atmosphere in the room had changed, from thickened. Everything changed on that day. There had. The distance between us has always existed. That imperceptible line that separated us separated, but it felt like that cue now had disappeared entirely without even I became aware that I had begun spending a lot more time spent with Elliot in the little moments appearing to be unimportant discussions. But in actuality, each one just increased our current level of anxiety. We even sat together and watched films. Previously, we would always maintain our distance. However, there was now an implicit pull, something we both felt between us, although never acknowledged that occasionally, when Elliot laid his arm down on the sofa while my hand came into contact with his leg, or when our A's the laughing blended, I sensed something odd within me, but I made an effort not to consider it. One evening, I was unable to. I kept turning over in bed while I slept, but my internal restlessness wouldn't let me just say that there was just one item on my in the mind. This couldn't continue, Elliot. I had to if he had affections for me. Put a limit. I had to stop and tell it directly. I got out of bed after giving it some thought. My heart was racing frantically, Yet my eye had already arrived at Elliot's. His room's door was ajar a little, and the interior was dimly lit, and the eye saw him when I entered the room. Was asleep at the time, but my eyes weren't focused on him, but rather on something else, something large, my breath. My body momentarily froze upon seeing. When he did that, a tempest raged inside. I should have avoided seeing it, have quickly turned around, but I stood there for a few seconds, didn't I? Attempting to comprehend my feelings. Then I hastily retreated, and there was anything within me that I was unable to suppress, but I was forced to disregard it. Laid down in my chamber again, but nothing was no longer the same, and that evening I had you have no idea how much more complicated things are. Would turn into whatever I did, I couldn't help but become closer with Elliot. As time goes on, the boundaries became increasingly hazy, and the tug between us just grew more intense. Didn't even recognize when it was over. So far, but the one thing I was certain of was that going back was turning into unthinkable, and then Elliot returned home. Like it, he was intoxicated. The sound from he knocked over the items on the door. George might have been awakened by sounds, but I understood how difficult it was for George to wake up. Up, so I hurriedly left my room and traveled to Elliot without even having time to arrange my garments properly. Before I stood just beside him, Elliot's eyes were dim and a little hazy. His lips formed a smile. "Are you real, Darlene?" he muttered. Alcohol caused the words to slur, but nonetheless, sincerely, I inhaled deeply and grasped. "Come on, Elliot. You can't leave his arm. We must be silent upstairs. Like this." However, Elliot's gaze was fixed on my face. He grinned gently and slowly, moving past me. "You realize you're actually. Have you always been this way, lovely? Or did I simply never?" I saw that I briefly froze, but then, Elliot, I quickly pulled myself together. "That's sufficient. I'll come to the kitchen. Make you some coffee." I guided him gradually to I was attempting to sober him up in the kitchen. Somewhat, however, due to Elliot's eyes and the statements he was making. Within me was also Elliot sat down on the chair and began to unwind. As I was making the coffee, when all of a sudden the cup fell out of his grasp and overflowed the counter, saying, "Ah, Elliot, you must use greater caution," I muttered, trying to tidy up the mess as soon as possible, but Elliot only grinned quietly. "Were you always this sweet?" I quickly cleaned. Up the kitchen, we were unable to remain here any longer. George had been sleeping upstairs for a while, but with Elliot in this condition, he was unable to cannot afford to create any more noise. "Okay, let's head upstairs, but I put my arm over you and warned you to be quiet," and directing him to the staircase. When we arrived at his room, his actions were considerably less stable, so he tried to adapt, but he was too out of it to complete it independently. At initially, I wanted to go back, but when I noticed him, I struggled to remove his shirt, automatically assisted him with my fingers groped for his shirt's buttons. At that point, Elliot's respiration slowed. The air was heavy with our strain. It was even more intense because of the silence. Was fully aware of what I was doing, yet at the however, I was unaware that Elliot was observing me in a new way. And this was one of the occasions we couldn't reclaim Elliot. Paused as he was getting dressed. He dropped his hands to his sides and met my gaze, at which point I discovered that my breathing had accelerated it. Was so silent that the room's atmosphere felt hefty, making it challenging to even, "I'm not playing this game. Breathe no longer, Darlene," he remarked quietly. Initially, but with confidence, my heart didn't blink as I gazed at him. Was thumping. However, what was Elliot attempting to do? To say, "Are you?" He added his voice, gradually deepening. We both caught each other once, and you don't believe I am aware that it crosses your mind. Before you go to sleep, a chill goes through you by forcing me to take a tiny step back, but my feet seem to be cemented to the ground. I whispered, "This isn't right, Elliot." But my Elliot grinned a little when his voice faltered. However, it wasn't a naive smile that we gone the stage of determining what's far too long ago. Darlene stopped lying to himself, then he moved onwards. Additionally, he was so near now that I could feel his breath on my body, reached up, gently trailing his fingertips. I tried to turn my head away over my cheek, but I couldn't since I secretly knew he was correct. And suddenly, Elliot's mouth touched mine. All the quiet, all the stress. The solution to everything was concealed in that, the ideas that are reverberating in my head right now. All of my misgivings abruptly stopped growing into murmurs since I hadn't objected. In actuality, Elliot, I had never wanted to, but my hands were shaking. Didn't back off when I recognized the resolve in Elliot's eyes. I had nothing more to conceal. Gulped, inhaled deeply, and gradually slid my clothes straps off I said, "You're right, Elliot." My voice was hardly audible above a breath. Let's stop playing this game. Getting closer to one another fully, I reclined on the bed. My heart thumped in my chest, but going back was no longer an option. Option Elliot hovered over me carefully, paused to look into my eyes, then, "Don't be afraid," he added with a smile. Kind and comforting voice, "Everything is correct." I averted my gaze as a chill went through me, even if I was unable to acknowledge it to myself. I was aware of how long I had been holding up. Right now, but I was unable to stop preventing the words from escaping my lips. "I'm a little afraid, Elliot." I stated, my breathing unequal due to a couple major factors. "I'm a little afraid, Elliot," I remarked. Breathing irregularly due to a couple large Elliot grinned and disregarded my stated as though he enjoyed it. Perhaps it was since he was Elliot leaned softly to my ear, inebriated, said, "George mustn't wake up." Understood his statement that there must be, I'm not sure how I felt in stillness, something enormous within myself, and I had to prevent myself from creating a loud sound. Elliot gave me a glance and spoke, such as, "Darlene, I know everything is fantastic, as well as you." How did he know that I believe he made a guess and understood me. Couldn't resist, so I shut down my eyes. I was firmly grasping the sheets, with my hands shaking and my body quivering, and I spasmed and put my hand over my lips, hands to avoid making any noise. Elliot was so inebriated that he was indifferent to anything. In fact, this was having an impact. I really enjoyed the event's energy. In addition to everything else and the irrepressible sense of grandeur, Heliot was exhausted, breathless, and intoxicated. "You're red, Elliot," I continued, "and we must." Elliot said, "Hurry up." "Okay, okay." However, he continued in the same manner, and I had another one more and more. Contraction, and I was unconcerned about anything else. I wasn't even myself anymore. "More," I muttered, closing my eyes. "Everything you desire, Elliot." Everything you, Elliot, must have found it appealing since he released himself. He released himself fully, and the heat inside of me was too much, so I put Elliot down right away in his bed and wrapped him in a blanket. Then I intended to take his bedroom, but I closed the door. A peaceful shower and unwind fully, I didn't know what was going to occur. Next, I wondered, what just happened? About it while taking a shower. But simultaneously, I was anxious and unhappy at the moment. But by when I left, my thoughts felt clearer. Strangely enough, I felt I was too calm to even be angry with myself. Because my physical state was as calm as my thoughts, I dressed quietly and I walked to my bed and dozed off as though, although nothing had occurred, the reality is, this was merely a thrilling time, flurry of heedless desire, but there was never so easy, and this wasn't going to remain straightforward or not. Stop right here. There aren't any bigger issues. Occurred more severe events, and in the George was going to learn in the end. Everything, there is yet more to this story. Don't forget to subscribe and follow so you don't miss the action. Next, enable alerts and leave a commenting keeps you ahead of the game. Your support for these articles means everything